situations where it doesn't apply, are there better ways of formulating that thought? But I would say, with regard to critical thought, and to some degree with regard to productive thought, an indeterminate proportion of that is dependent on speech. I don't think it's unreasonable to point out that thought is internalized speech, and that the dialectical process that constitutes critical thinking is internalized speech. So you and I are engaging in a dialectic enterprise. You'll posit something and I'll respond to it, and you'll respond to that, and we're in a kind of combat. There's some cooperation about it as well, and we're attempting to formulate a truth more clearly, at least in principle, if we're being honest. We do that when we're speaking. So our thought, the quality of our thought, is actually dependent on our ability to speak our minds.
Absolutely.
And then, so go ahead.
Well, I couldn't agree more, because I think speech is the way in which we collaborate on our thoughts. You know, that's how it works. You refine those thought processes that you've described. I mean, I'm no psychologist, but I understand this basic premise that we have these various thoughts that are continually in conflict within ourselves. Unless we're able to articulate them and to engage in others through that process, through that transactional process of speech, then those thoughts are never refined, and they remain in this kind of infancy. And this is
yes, well, they're as refined as we can make them as individuals. Sure. But that's also assuming that you even have the words, which you also learned in a dialectical process.
Right, exactly. It's not as though the truth is ever fully graspable, but we can get nearer to it through that collaborative process of speaking and articulating the thoughts. And in fact, even in the act of, like you say, writing or articulating yourself, as with your self-authoring program, for instance, the act of writing things out is what clarifies the point of view for you. I've actually found that the way that I think about these issues now is largely a product of the fact that I've written so much about it and change my mind through the act of learning how to express myself on these points. And the consequence of not having that opportunity, I think, is something I would barely want to contemplate. And I think that, to give an example of the moment, which is that because any kind of attempt to have a discussion or debate about the perceived conflict between trans rights and gender critical feminism, because to even attempt that discussion at the moment will have such grave social consequences, and certainly in terms of career prospects, major consequences, people will not have that discussion. I have people I know in politics, in the media, and they say to me quite honestly, I will not talk about this. I have concerns, I have qualms, I want answers to questions, but I absolutely will not open my mouth about this. And if you don't do that, this is why no one understands the issue. This is why no one has reached any kind of consensus on this issue. All we have is a sense in which to have the quote-unquote wrong opinion makes you a pariah, and therefore I better not have that opinion. Well, then that's not a sincerely held conviction.
If the definition of wrong is continually transforming and in an unpredictable manner, then it's best just to sidestep the issue entirely. And then that leaves it murky and ill-defined, and assuming that you believe that thought has any utility. And so when you're sitting down to write, or when I'm sitting down to write, and I produce a sentence, you know, it might have come from some theoretical perspective. Maybe I'm approaching something from a Freudian perspective, or a Marxist perspective, or an Enlightenment perspective, etc. I mean, it's a psychological trope, I suppose, that we all think the thoughts of dead philosophers, right? We think we have our own opinions, but that's really rarely, very, very, very rarely the case. It's not that easy to come up with something truly original, and generally make incremental progress at best. And so your ability to abstractly represent the world and then to generate avatars that can be defeated without you dying is dependent on your incorporation of a multitude of opinions. And that in itself is a consequence of, I mean, that works to the degree that communication is actually free and that you can get access to as much thought as you can possibly manage. So I can't see how you can deny the centrality of free speech as a fundamental right, or the fundamental right perhaps, unless you simultaneously deny the utility of thought. But maybe if you are also inclined to remove the individual from the central position of the political discourse, then maybe you can also make the case, at least implicitly, that individual thought doesn't matter and that mostly it's just causing trouble.
But I think individual thought is key, and actually, even in the outline you've described there is individual agency in reaching a conclusion that has been articulated before, insofar as if you are engaged with a multitude of writers and philosophers and artists and ideas, and you've come out with a perspective, well, that perspective may not be original to you, but the process that you've gone through to reach that viewpoint is individual to you. There is a power in that. So there's something important about that.
There's something crucial. If you're a practicing psychotherapist, one of the things you have to learn is to not provide people with your words too much. What you want is for them to formulate the conclusion. And you can guide them through the process of investigation. You talked about the self-authoring process, which is online at selfauthoring.com, that it steps people, say, through the process of writing an autobiography, of analyzing their current virtues and faults, and of making a future plan. The utility of all of that is dependent on the person who's undertaking the exercise, generating their own verbal representations, right?
Yes.
And that seems to cement it somehow as yours if you've come up with the words. And so it's the uppermost expression of personhood, the ability to have the words that you should speak reveal themselves to you and to have the right to express them as you see fit.
Yes, in which case, if you are merely repeating an accepted script, then to what extent can you even say to be an individual at all? This to me.
Well, I think that's part of the philosophical conundrum, is that if you believe that all people do is repeat predigested scripts, especially if your view is that the fundamental human motivation is power, and the entire social landscape is nothing but a competition between equally, what would you say, selfish and single-minded power strivers, then there is no individual. There's no individual in that conceptual world. And it seems to me that that's the world that we're being pushed to inhabit and are criticized for, on moral grounds, for criticizing. And I'm still trying to get my hands around this. I mean, when I went to Britain, I saw the CCTV cameras and the increased security, and it isn't clear to me how that's related to the social justice issues, that so-called social justice issues that we're discussing, but they seem to me in some very difficult to comprehend way part and parcel of the same thing, the same dangerous thing.
Well, I think it's probably connected just in terms of this distrust of humanity, or this belief that people need to be shepherded. Otherwise, left to their own devices, chaos will reign. I think that's the connection. It's not directly connected as far as the issues relating to liberty and CCTV obviously predate what we now call, whatever the current social justice movement is called. But I think there is something there. I mean, the censorship, the impulse to censor what people read, and this is something that particularly hits home to me in the arts, is based on this view that ultimately it's the people or the populace is liable to corruption if they're exposed to the wrong materials. And what's very interesting to me about that, I mean, you've written a lot about the way in which literature, for instance, informs our experiences, because it is, in a sense, like when you read philosophers, you're feeling your way through other lives and other experiences that are trans-historical and cross-cultural, and they inform the way that you react in your own individual experience. But if you start to say, as an artist, no, you can only represent, for a start, what you personally are or have experienced, and you cannot represent anything which is morally problematic, to use the phrase that they absolutely adore, then art fails to, and literature in particular, fails to function in the way that it should, because you can't explore those things. This is why I often, when it comes to censorship of the arts, I often go back to what Oscar Wilde said about this. He said there's no such thing as a moral or an immoral book. Books are well written or badly written, that is all. And that actually art and morality sometimes are not one. In other words, art shouldn't just be about promoting whatever the ethical trend is of any given time. It's much bigger.
Well, it's not art at that point at all.
Well, it's
as far as I'm concerned, if you can state the purpose of the art in explicit terms, especially if it's in accordance with let's say an ideology that's shared by a multitude of people, it's not art at all. It's propaganda.
It's totally banal. I mean, this is why so many people are getting sick of Hollywood. I mean, to bring it down to a different level, that people are sick of the entertainment on their TV, on their streaming services, and on Hollywood, because they have this constant feeling that they're being hectored by some moralistic person in a studio saying, you know, our focus here is on diversity. Our focus here is on the right moral message, that the message of the story is one that would be approved by a group of intersectional activists. And you get this all the time seeping into mainstream entertainment, and people get really, really sick of it. It's not that when you see a lesbian kiss in Star Wars that offends you because you're a homophobe. Most sci-fi fans they've never had a problem with diversity or anything like that. What bothers them about it is this sense of someone saying to them, we think you're all evil bigots and you need to be educated, and that's why we're going to shoehorn in a lesbian kiss into the end of this film. That's why people have a problem. I mean, you had it yourself recently with that ludicrous Marvel Comics thing where you became the Red Skull. And that, to me, was a perfect example of the banality of an artistic endeavour that becomes an exercise in political pedagogy. Because that was quite clearly... I mean, you couldn't even say it was satirical, because it cannot be satirically effective if the thing that they are comparing you to is the precise opposite of the thing you believe. I mean, of all the sort of public figures I can think of, you have the most clear track record of opposing tyranny in all its forms, which anyone who knows anything about your work will know. You've spent years lecturing about the evils of authoritarianism, including Nazism. So the idea that you would then become this super magic Nazi is propagandistic. It's totally banal artistically. Firstly, it's not satirically right, but also it's just. Do you know what it reminds me of? Actually, I don't know if you remember after the fatwa against Salman Rushdie, there was a film made in Pakistan called International Guerrillas, where they turned Salman Rushdie into this evil villain playboy who was colluding with the Israeli military services. And at the end of the film, these flying copies of the Quran float down and shoot laser beams into his head and kill him off. And that is such a ridiculous, laughable film. You know, you put your enemy as the main villain and you just misrepresent him in that way. Well, that's just what they did to you. It's as banal as that. And I think people are sick of that.
Well, the response, thankfully, seems to indicate that, no, it didn't do me any harm, as far as I can tell. I mean, it was very shocking to me that it happened. It took me about 12 hours to sort of regain my composure, because I actually couldn't believe it to begin with. I was sure that it was a fabrication.
Yeah.
Especially, but then it was even more shocking when I found out who had authored it. You know, it was someone who had an intellectual reputation. And so...
But he's an activist, isn't he? He's an intersectional activist.
His opinions definitely place him on the side of the radical left. So it's very difficult to... So there's an attack on the essence of free speech. I mean, I remember reading Derrida. Derrida criticized our culture, Western culture, as phallogocentric.
Yeah. And
it's really actually quite a precise word. So the phallic part of it is masculine, obviously, related to the phallus, and logos is, well, that's the central concept of Greek rationalism, but it's also the central concept of Christianity. And the logos is something like the magical power of genuine and true speech. It's something like that. And there are representations of the magical power of speech that predate Greece and Christianity. You see it in Mesopotamia. The equivalent to the savior in ancient Mesopotamian religious thinking was Marduk, and he could speak magic words. He had eyes all the way around his head, which meant that he paid attention to everything, but he could speak magic words. And so that idea of the centrality of speech and its association with the very fabric of reality, that's been an idea that has strived to make itself manifest for thousands and thousands of years. I mean, in the Judeo-Christian tradition, in the biblical tradition, the word is given cosmological status as the thing that brings habitable order out of chaos, and it's identified with divinity itself. And so the assault on free speech is an assault on a principle that's fundamental beyond, say, its centrality, its central importance to the Enlightenment. It is it's an assault on the idea of the logos itself.
I agree. This is why I always mistrusted the post-structuralists. So when I was studying for English, it was the Derrida and Foucault and Lyotard, and these were taken as a given. And this idea that there is no truth beyond language. You know, language is all. Language is the way in which we construct our perception of reality and our perception of truth, and that actually there is no truth at the heart of it. I just found it so depressingly pessimistic, because it also means that you can construct any kind of reality you like, and it
Well,
also.
and maybe that's part of the motivation for it, is the hypothetical lack of constraint by anything that seems to imply, right? I mean, if there's no canonical reality, well, there's no responsibility, that's for sure. You could argue that there's no meaning and it's deeply pessimistic, but maybe the payoff for that is no responsibility, but there's also no constraint of any sort. There's certainly no ethical constraint. And I mean, I keep trying to dig to see what's at the bottom of this anti-logos sentiment, and it's a very difficult thing to get right.
Maybe it's not even as deliberate as the way that it sounds. Maybe it is just the fact that these theories, for whatever reason, became fashionable in universities about 20 years ago, and now, for whatever reason, they have escaped into the mainstream. And you know, I mean, most of the people that push this stuff don't read Foucault, and they don't know about the people whose ideas they've imbibed and actually very much misunderstood. You know, I mean, the whole point of the postmodernists was to trash the notion of grand narratives, and what we have now in the social justice movement is an incredible grand narrative. You know, we are on the right side of history. We are the righteous ones, and everyone else needs to be, decimated. And it seems to me that this stuff, I don't think it's as conspiratorial as that. I think it's just sort of circumstances of history, one thing after another, and this is where we're at now. But the end result that we have to deal with, which I think you've alluded to, is this idea that if there is no such thing as reality beyond language, then you are at liberty to construct whatever pseudo-reality that you desire or is easiest for you. And we see elements of this reverberating, I think, in a lot of the discourse at the moment of things like lived experience. You know, you can present as much data as you want, but it will be disregarded if it doesn't tally with what...
Oh, what now?
Related to the phallus, and logos is, well, that's the central concept of Greek rationalism, but it's also the central concept of Christianity. And the logos is something like the magical power of genuine and true speech. It's something like that, and there are representations of the magical power of speech that predate Greece and Christianity. You see it in Mesopotamia. The equivalent to the savior in ancient Mesopotamian religious thinking was Marduk, and he could speak magic words. He had eyes all the way around his head, which meant that he paid attention to everything, but he could speak magic words. And so that idea of the centrality of speech and its association with the very fabric of reality, that's been an idea that has strived to make itself manifest for thousands and thousands of years. I mean, in the Judeo-Christian tradition, in the biblical tradition, the word is given cosmological status as the thing that brings habitable order out of chaos, and it's identified with divinity itself. And so the assault on free speech is an assault on a principle that's fundamental beyond, say, its centrality, its central importance to the Enlightenment, and it's an assault on the idea of the logos itself.
I agree. This is why I've always mistrusted the post-structuralists. When I was studying for English, it was the Derrida and Foucault and Lyotard, and these were taken as a given, and this idea that there is no truth beyond language. You know, language is all. Language, the way in which we construct our perception of reality and our perception of truth, and actually there is no truth at the heart of it. I just found it so depressingly pessimistic, because it also means that you can construct any kind of reality you like, and it
Well,
also.
and maybe that's part of the motivation for it, is the hypothetical lack of constraint by anything that seems to imply, right? I mean, if there's no canonical reality, well, there's no responsibility, that's for sure. You could argue that there's no meaning and it's deeply pessimistic, but maybe the payoff for that is no responsibility, but there's also no constraint of any sort. There's certainly no ethical constraint. And I mean, I keep trying to dig to see what's at the bottom of this anti-logos sentiment, and it's a very difficult thing to get right.
Maybe it's not even as deliberate as the way that it sounds. Maybe it is just the fact that these theories, for whatever reason, became fashionable in universities about 20 years ago, and now, for whatever reason, they have escaped into the mainstream. And you know, I mean, most of the people that push this stuff don't read Foucault, and they don't know about the people whose ideas they've imbibed and actually very much misunderstood. You know, I mean, the whole point of the postmodernists was to trash the notion of grand narratives, and what we have now in the social justice movement is an incredible grand narrative. You know, we are on the right side of history. We are the righteous ones, and everyone else needs to be, decimated. It seems to me that this stuff. I don't think it's as conspiratorial as that. I think it's just sort of circumstances of history, one thing after another, and this is where we're at now. But the end result that we have to deal with, which I think you've alluded to, is this idea that if there is no such thing as reality beyond language, then you are at liberty to construct whatever pseudo-reality that you desire, or is easiest for you. And we see elements of this reverberating, I think, in a lot of the discourse at the moment, of things like lived experience. You know, you can present as much data as you want, but it will be disregarded if it doesn't tally with what lived experience really means, which is what I want to be true.
Well, there's also this insistence that seems part of it that, I mean, I objected to some legislation that was passed in Canada, and that's sort of what propelled me into public visibility, let's say. And to begin with, I was mostly concentrating on the violation of the principle of free speech that the legislation seemed to me to represent, because it compelled certain utterances, and I was never a fan of hate speech laws to begin with, and this was something beyond hate speech laws, because hate speech laws stop you from saying things, whereas compelled speech laws force you to say something, which is much worse, even though the first one is also ill-advised as far as I'm concerned. But now, I've realized more recently that I was also disturbed, although in a less explicit manner, with the theory of identity that was an implicit part of the legislation. So with gender identity, for example, and we're engaged in a discussion across our culture about gender identity. I mean, I know as a personality psychologist that there are females, biological females, who have masculine personalities, and there are biological males who have feminine personalities. The link between personality as such and biological structure is suggestive but not absolute, and there's a lot of variability. But the idea that identity is something that you define yourself and that you can change at will at any point seems to me to be entirely counterproductive and dangerous, because it's inaccurate. So your identity isn't merely your membership in whatever group you happen to identify with at that moment. It's certainly not merely your sexuality or merely your race. In fact, your identity is barely your race, because your identity is something more like how you conduct yourself in the world.
Yes.
And if you define yourself as black, let's say, that doesn't give you much of a map to encountering and approaching the world. It's nowhere near detailed enough. And then the idea that you define it, I've been thinking about that a lot. You never define your identity by yourself. You can't, because you're surrounded by other people and they have to play along with you. And if they don't play along with you voluntarily, which means they appreciate the quality of your game and they understand it, then you're either going to be alienated or you have to impose your identity by force. But that's also not a very good solution. I mean, I just spent some time interviewing one of the world's foremost authorities on aggression, and that'll be released in a bit. Perhaps it's being released before this will be released. He's done longitudinal studies of aggression, and if the idea that our social structures are predicated on power was true, then children would start out not being aggressive and they would become more aggressive with time, and the more aggressive children would be more successful. And none of that is true. Children start out more aggressive than they are on average by the time they're adults. Aggression levels decrease with age rather than increasing, and there's no evidence whatsoever that it's a useful long-term strategy in the social world. Identity is something you negotiate the way you negotiate a game.
Yeah.
It's more, it has to be that way. And so
there's something rather sinister, isn't there, about the way in which present-day identity politics is about imposition onto others, rather than an assertion of who I am or whatever that might be. I mean, I always mistrusted it. So I can see the utility of identity politics, politically speaking, in scenarios where people are marginalised. You know, I understand why gay people collectively came together back in the 60s to fight for their rights, because there was obviously a serious problem with the civil rights movement in Northern Ireland in the 60s and 70s and that kind of thing, where Catholics weren't able to have the vote or to get housing. So that sort of makes sense to me. The current identity politic, or what we might call identitarians, a lot of it strikes me as about power. In fact, I feel like they would be an incredible subject for Foucault if he were alive today. Because I've noticed this correlation, and a lot of people have noticed this correlation, and I never get an answer about this. But why is it whenever online, whenever I'm viciously attacked or threatened, something particularly pernicious, the person doing it always has their pronouns in their bio or a rainbow gay flag in their bio? Why is there a correlation that I've experienced again and again? I mean, it's almost inevitable at this point, between the need to self-identify in terms of sexuality and gender, and a kind of cruelty or viciousness or a need to attack, an aggression.
Well, one of the things that disturbs me constantly about ideological representations of the world, broadly speaking, is that their fundamental danger is that they always contain a too convenient theory of evil and malevolence. And for me, any theory that locates the fundamental problem of evil somewhere other than inside you is dangerous. Now, that isn't to say that social structures can't be corrupted and aren't corrupt. That's an existential problem in and of itself. It's always the case that our social institutions aren't what they should be, and they're outdated, and they're predicated to some degree on deceit, and people who use power to manipulate them, sometimes successfully. That problem never goes away, and it never will. But when the evil can be easily located somewhere else, then you have every moral right to allow your unexamined motivations to manifest themselves fully, because you can punish the evildoers and always remain on the moral side of the fence. There's a huge attractiveness in that.
I mean, this is something you've explored a lot with the idea of the Solzhenitsyn's idea about the good and evil cutting through the heart of every human being, because that to me it really gets to the heart of a lot of what I would call a kind of infantile culture. I think this is a symptom of childishness. You know, whenever I was learning about literature and what constituted more sophisticated literature and what didn't, Disney films, childish films. Let's take Tolkien for instance. Bad people look bad. They look like orcs. They're ugly, and there are villains, and then there are heroes, and they are good. There isn't complexity, and if you have a more complex novel like a Mervyn Peake novel where people aren't necessarily good or bad, they're both, they struggle within themselves and with other people, that is a mark of a kind of adult novel as opposed to a childish novel, right? And that's quite an important distinction. And I think most of the political and ideological battles that I find myself in the middle of, and I'm sure you do as well, are because people are just reducing everything to this binary of good versus evil and putting themselves on the side of good. It is a very infantile, almost like a caricature of religion. You know, it's and I see it again and again. We had it in this country with the Brexit vote. Effectively, what happened in the vote here, and the reason why it became so toxic and families fell apart, and you know, you wouldn't believe. I know it wasn't reported very much elsewhere, but it was like a kind of ideological civil war here, but not a very sophisticated one, because it came down to this narrative that if you voted to leave the EU, you were evil, racist, stupid, and if you voted to remain, you were good and progressive and all the rest, and noble and virtuous, right? And of course, there are all sorts of good reasons to have voted either way, and this kind of caricature, and it happens again with.
Well, you described it as a caricature of religion, and I think that's what an ideology is. And this is one of the reasons that I've been inclined, let's say, to have my shot at the rational atheists, much as I'm a fan of Enlightenment thinking. I mean, I was convinced, as a consequence of reading Jung primarily, but also Dostoevsky, and also Nietzsche primarily, and Solzhenitsyn, I would say, as well, that, and then biology as well, as I studied that more deeply. There's no escaping a religious framework. There's no way out of it. And if you eliminate it, say, as a consequence of rational criticism, what you inevitably produce is its replacement by forms of religion that are much less sophisticated. I mean,
well, it's not religion. It's a fundamentalist religion. It's, you know, if I look back to my Catholic upbringing, actually acknowledging your own capacity for sin is at the heart of Catholicism. That's why we have the confessional. That's why you sit there and tell this stranger all these things you've done wrong. Because it's reckoning with it.
That's far from trivial. It's unbelievably not trivial. And because it was so common, like a common part of Catholicism, it can be passed over without notice. And so the religious structures that we inherited, I'm going to talk about Christianity most specifically because it's the dominant form of, it's the form of religious belief that primarily undergirds our social structures. It's our operating system. My producer came up with that term the other day, and I thought it was apt. And it does localize the drama between good and evil inside, and makes you responsible for that, and makes you, encourages you, let's say, to attend to the ways that you fall short of the ideal. And when you criticize a structure like that out of existence, you don't criticize the questions that gave rise to it out of existence. And the questions might be, well, what's the nature of the good? What's the nature of evil? Those are religious questions. What's the purpose of our life? How do you orient yourself if you're trying to move up, let's say, rather than down? How should you conduct yourself, etc., etc.? Those questions don't go away, and they can't not be answered. And so the way that a traditional religious structure answers them is in a mysterious way. It uses ritual, it uses music, it uses art, it uses literature, it uses stories, all these things that are outside the realm of easy criticism. And then some of that's translated into, you know, comprehensible, explicit dogma, and that's the part that's most susceptible to rational criticism. But when that disappears, I've been thinking about this a lot this week because of what happened to Richard Dawkins recently. You know, and I have my differences with Dawkins and the rest of the rational atheists because I think that they underestimated the danger of dispensing with what they were attempting to dispense with. And I see the influx of religious fervor associated with political ideas as a direct consequence of the lack of separation, let's say, between church and state psychologically.
But Dawkins has fallen foul of this new religion, but his case actually really is testimony to what we're talking about, that this is not a religion in a traditional sense. It is an infantile religion that only sees things in binaries of good and evil, because he was posing a question about identity. He was saying, if it is possible for Rachel Dolezal to identify as black, why is she universally condemned and derided, but somebody can identify as the opposite sex and they are celebrated? And all he was doing was posing the question. He wasn't even actually making a claim.
Yeah, well, he was doing what a scientist actually does. I mean, I've been shocked frequently in my interactions with journalists, because I've worked as a scientist for 3 decades, and I'm accustomed to the way that scientists think and speak. And when I'm sitting around with my graduate students and there's a problem, an issue, what they do, my colleagues as well, is generate a bunch of hypotheses about why that might be. They don't necessarily believe them, but the first trick is to generate as many, what would you say, hypotheses, I said that already, that might account for it, ranging from biological through social, etc. And that is exactly what Dawkins did. He even said that's what he was doing.
That puts you on the side of the devil. I mean, there was a viral tweet this week from a teacher saying, I will never allow my pupils to play devil's advocate. I will never allow that in the class, because some views are oppressive and are not to be entertained. I mean, but that's the point. That's why the Vatican will call in a devil's advocate when someone is potentially being canonized.
Well, if you can't play devil's advocate, you can't think.
That's it.
You have to have a devil's advocate in your head. If you don't have a devil's advocate in your head torturing every thought you generate, you're not engaged in critical thinking.
Right, but
that's for sure.
That's the scientific process to disprove yourself. I mean, that's what surprises me about Richard Dawkins' response, because I think what he didn't realise is that he was caught in this good versus evil binary, and he was the heretic now. He had been branded. He posed the question you're not meant to pose, and therefore he's now outed himself as one of the demons. He's there in pandemonium.
Yeah, he's a straw man.
Now,
he's a straw man for the religions.
Then he, of course, backtracked and apologised and said, "Well, I didn't want to offend
the religion
anyone."
of science.
And of course, in an
straw
adult
man
rational
for.
world, that would be taken in good faith and what. But he didn't. I don't think he fully appreciated what's going on here. Is that he's already marked himself as the
Well,
sinner.
here's his apology, let's say. Now, what he should have said, as far as I'm concerned, here's what he said.
Okay.
I do not intend to disparage trans people. I see that my academic discuss question has been misconstrued as such, and I deplore this. It was also not my intent to ally in any way with Republican bigots in the U.S. now exploiting this issue. And so, it's so interesting that that's what he did.
Right, straw
Well,
man.
he's buying into the tribalism thing. You know,
Well, it's also
He's a straw man.
It's not the best response to defend him. What he should have said was something like, "Look, people, here's something to think about that I was posing. That's what scientists do, and you didn't understand that. But that's not my problem. It's your lack of sophistication." But he, instead of saying that, he immediately removed himself from the bad people, and that was the Republican bigots, which just seems
Then maybe,
to me
Jordan,
to
you should stop relying on robots. There's no evidence that there's even a human being in Dawkins anymore. You know, it could have been over 20 years ago. We don't know what we're dealing with that fucking dude. He's definitely a straw man robot, I would say.
To be fair to him, I understand when you're caught in the middle of a Twitter storm, you just wanted to stop. And I've heard you talk about this as well. Is actually your response probably isn't going to be the best when you just wanted to go away.
No, well, look, I mean, one of the things that's really worth pointing out here, and it's not like I don't have sympathy for Dawkins. I have sympathy for Dawkins. I sent out a tweet defending him yesterday. I mean, Dawkins is an admirable scientist in my estimation. I learned lots from reading his books.
That's the problem. That's the problem.
That doesn't mean I don't have my criticisms of Dawkins, but just because you have criticisms of someone doesn't mean that they've never done anything worthwhile or that you haven't learned something from them.
He has done something worthwhile. He's turned it all around on you. Made you think up is down, left is right, black is white, and white is gray, and red is yellow, and you're all fucked up.
I just don't understand why. Okay, so back to the Twitter issue. So what I've seen repeatedly, and this is worth some discussion, is when I'm watching Twitter, when I'm watching these attacks on people, what I've seen, the most general pattern of response to be is that it doesn't take very many people attacking you on Twitter before it's seriously psychologically disturbing.
Yeah.
You know, and that is interestingly related to this whole issue of
Because it's
hate speech
entertainment.
that we've been discussing. Because
It's all entertainment
it is the
for all
case that
sides.
vicious attacks have quite a pronounced psychological effect, especially if they're personal. And people generally fold and apologize instantly if my sense has been if the Twitter mob is 20 people. It's sort of like they're reacting to 20 of their neighbors showing up on their doorsteps with pitchforks and torches. And I think it's actually an admirable response in some sense, because a well-socialized person actually does care what their neighbors think. And if you offend 20 of your neighbors, it's possible, 20 of your tribe, it's possible that you've done something wrong. You might ask yourself that. Now, on Twitter, you're connected to hundreds of thousands of people, and if you would offend 20, it's not clear what that means. It might just mean that you said something.
It feels a lot worse than it actually is as well. It feels amplified because there's all these people who are strangers who know absolutely nothing about you. And it's particularly frustrating because more often than not, when it's happened to me, it's always been an imagined grievance. It's not actually something I've said, it's something that they've assumed that I've said. Or a way that they have interpreted this. And the more you try and fight back against it or try and explain your actual position, the more they double down on their, and you've had this as well. People are going after a figment of their own imagination. That's impossible to fend off, and it does do psychological harm. And I've never denied that. And this is something I addressed in the book because I quoted, I can't remember her name now, but the writer talking about how hate speech could be said to be violence insofar as the psychological impact can have a physiological impact. It can make you sick. It can make you unwell.
Yep.
The impact of words. But of course, the example I use is taxation. I could fall physically sick because I'm under stress from being overly taxed by the government. Does that mean that the government has committed an act of violence against me?
Yep.
It could be applied to absolutely anything, I think.
Well, an anarchist would argue yes.
Yes, I would say yes.
Exactly, but that wouldn't be me. But you could apply that to absolutely any
I must be an
conceivable
anarchist
scenario
then.
where anything that has happened to you has led to stress and physical degeneration. And so I don't think it's right to single speech out and say that speech is that we can say that is violence.
Also, it's a one-sided argument because dangerous as free speech is, we don't ever have to deny that there's such a thing as hateful speech or damaging speech or corrosive speech or untruth speech or pathological speech in every possible direction. That isn't the issue. The issue is what's more dangerous, to regulate it or to leave it be, despite its dangers.
Right.
That's
Exactly.
the only rational argument, the only complete argument. Let's
Should
say.
be no argument. Should be no argument on any side about freedom of speech. Right? It's so ridiculous. But they did that with everything. We don't have the freedom to fart anymore. You're going to pay taxes on your cow's flatulence. You're going to pay for your own flatulence. You're going to pay for every time taxes, every time you flush your toilet. You're going to pay more taxes because they're going to consider everything hazardous waste and everything is contamination and everything as a bio threat.
I think that's the bigger principle that's at stake here. I worry that with
So to
social
argue
media
about
and
it
Twitter
is
as well,
ridiculous
that
to even
we end
argue
up
about it in the first place.
buying
There
into
should
the
be no
illusion that there
argument.
are more hateful
Just
people
tell them to go
involved than
fuck
there actually
themselves and
are.
everybody
Because
live a
even
normal,
the people
regular,
who send these hateful things
truthful
probably
life
wouldn't
rather
believe
than
that
going by
real life
all
is
these
something
lies
about
on all
the
sides.
online world.
Ridiculous.
And what it does is absolutely, I mean, this is the heart of cancel culture. This is why it works. Like you said, it's just a few tweets. That's all it takes. I've seen situations where companies and corporations will backtrack on a policy just because of one or two tweets, because they fear this deluge of people. It has such disproportionate power. And often with this kind of cancel culture, it is often about something that someone hasn't even said. The example of Dawkins is perfect because a lot of the people, and some prominent people I saw, were saying, look, Dawkins has now outed himself as a transphobe. If you said to them, Where is
You
the
hinted
transphobia?
it
Yeah, you
again
do that with
tomorrow,
everybody.
bucko.
I could have
Yeah,
swore
well,
I saw
fine,
Alex
because if
Jones
someone is transphobic
on the
simply because
House
you've
floor with
decided that,
under the
you
January
know, I mean,
6th
it was the
committee
same with J.K. Rowling.
yesterday, right?
It became
I haven't heard
suddenly
nothing about it on
quite
Fox or
normal
anything like that, but I
for
could have swore
commentators
I
on the
was
mainstream
flicking
media to
through and I
say that
saw
she has
his
said transphobic
picture
things. Well,
on
where?
the
Because I've
and
read her
talking,
comments and her
and
essay
then by the time I
on the
got
trans
to
issue
it,
that
I
she posted
lost
on
it,
her blog,
and
and it was a
I
long
didn't go back and look.
essay which
Matter
was
of fact, I
very
did try to
compassionate and
rewind it. I
nuanced.
tried to
And at
rewind a
no
little bit and
point,
see
it's the
what the hell
opposite.
that
She
was
said that
about.
she supports
I'll have to
trans
look for
rights and
that
she would
today.
stand there against any discrimination. If you and I've been in these fights all the time. If ever you ask someone, say, can you just quote the transphobic thing that she said? They never can. And an adult would say, okay, I can't find the evidence of my preconception, so therefore I should revise my view. But they don't. They double down on it and they find these sort of, they use casuistry and whatever linguistic, semantic tricks they can to come back round to the conclusion they'd already decided. Same with Dawkins. I mean, not just the American Humanist Association, but a blogger saying that anyone who is defending him is transphobic. And like, well, if that's all it takes to be smeared in this way, if it doesn't matter what you say, if all that matters is what people decide that you believe, then I suppose this goes back to this pseudo-reality we were discussing.
Well,
that
I
actually,
guess what Dawkins got in trouble for, let's take it apart a bit, okay? Because it's worth doing. He said, this is his original tweet, in 2015, Rachel Dolezal, a white chapter president of NAACP, was vilified for identifying as black. Some men choose to identify as women, and some women choose to identify as men. You will be vilified if you deny that they literally are what they identify as. Discuss. Okay, so he put forth a set of propositions, but the proposition has a point. And the point is, what is it that you can and can't identify with? And what power do people have to enforce their decision on others? And that's really the question he's asking if you strip it down. And that is actually a question that's very
The question I'm
threatening
asking
to,
you, Jordan Peterson,
well, let's
why
see, who
would
would
you
it
be
be threatening
arguing with a
to? Well, it would
fucking
be threatening
robot?
to anyone who insists
The dude's a
that
robot. He's not
you
even
can
a real
choose an
human being.
identity,
So
say in the
I don't know
realm
what the hell
of
you're
gender,
arguing with him
and
for.
that you should have
Not
the
that I
right
have
to
a problem
enforce